Okay, so good evening. I'm Jim Folsom, Director of the Gardens, and it's great to see such a wonderful turnout. I take it you all own ranches. Okay. So welcome to the Huntington and to this is a really nice lecture hall, and I know I've seen some of you on other occasions. We have several series of lectures that happen here, and we're still fishing around for what's the best time. It looks like 7 o'clock on a Monday is all right. So that's working well. I'm here mainly to welcome you, to tell you where you are, and to tell you what to do in the case of an emergency like a blackout or something. So you're in a big lecture hall. There are exits. Both take you completely outside. If you need the restrooms, they are around behind you in the lobby on the back side, the north side of the auditorium. And if you are packing one of these, so I'm going to ask you to pull it out and do whatever it takes to silence it. Turn it off or whatever you have to do, so that you can pay attention to the ongoing story. I'm not here to introduce the lecturer, the speaker. Ann Scheid is here to do that. So I'm going to introduce Ann Scheid, who's with the California Landscape and Garden History Society and has been a speaker herself. So Ann. Oh, I want to tell you, after the store, I should have said this is my job. The bookstore will reopen after the lecture, and you'll be able to buy books, and the author will be there to sign, and you might check a lot of the information, I understand, came out of a Huntington publication called The Cattle on 1,000 Hills, and the bookstore restocked that so that would be available also as part of your booty that you take home. And now I'll give you Ann.
Thank you very much, Jim. And on behalf of the California Garden and Landscape History Society, I want to thank the Huntington, especially Jim, for hosting our series on historic landscapes. We have been having these lectures since 2015. I'm not sure anymore how many we've had. We've had 1 or 2 a year. And I just actually wanted to ask, how many of you have attended these before? Is there Okay, very good. And we hope you'll come to more of them. We're planning more, of course. And then I wanted to introduce you to those of you who don't know us. We are the California Garden and Landscape History Society, or for short, CGLHS. And it's still a long, a long thing to remember. But our organization is now 25 years old. We were founded in 1996. And we came together to celebrate California's historic landscapes of all kinds: private gardens, grand gardens, such as the Huntington, parks, public landscapes, such as street trees, agricultural landscapes, such as ranches, orchards, groves, farmsteads, ethnic gardens and landscapes, anything that's designed by man and not, Yosemite and nature. Although Yosemite is designed too, but we won't go into that. Maybe we should do something on that. Okay, and California is so special, as I think you probably all know. It has such a wide range of climates, from north to south, from coast to desert, and offers more variety and possibility for designed landscapes than almost any other state. I would say than any other state. And we are the only state organization with an organization of this kind that is devoted to our landscape history. Our activities include quarterly publications, and this is a picture of an example of Eden, which is our quarterly publication. This is the Batchelder Garden in Pasadena. And we also have, and there are examples on the table out there that you can look at or purchase if you'd like. This year, our annual conference will be in Lompoc, and we're going to be looking at Mission Gardens and contrasting the mission gardens of the 20th century with what the mission gardens may have been way long ago. And that's a very interesting topic. We are also devoted to educating the public with tours and talks, and this is all in an effort to make people aware of historic landscapes and also to encourage their preservation. Please consider joining us. You can get more information in the lobby. Now I'd like to turn to our speaker for tonight, and we are really honored to have such a distinguished speaker, Marc Appleton, AIA. Marc is the founding principal of Appleton Partners Architects of Santa Monica and Santa Barbara. He has a BA from Harvard College and a Master of Architecture from Yale, and he apprenticed in several architectural firms, including Frank Gehry's firm, before opening his own practice in 1976. His work has won numerous awards and has been widely published in Architectural Digest, Town and Country, and other periodicals. But Marc is unusual as an architect because he's also an author and a publisher. And he wrote an introduction to a classic of California architecture, Rexford Newcomb's Mediterranean Domestic Architecture in the United States. That's a book from the 1920s that has been reprinted, and it is a classic of its kind. He also wrote a book on George Washington Smith, and California Mediterranean is another title. The New Classicists is another title, and he assisted in the publication of a book about the Casa del Herrero in Santa Barbara, and a reprint of Myron Hunt at Occidental College by Robert Winter. And that booklet, it's 36 pages, it's really a booklet, is for sale tonight, and it's out on the table out there. And then he also is involved in a new series on the master architects of Southern California. 2 of them have been published so far, one on Gordon Kaufman and the second on Roland Coate. But tonight he's going to be talking about his book on ranches, Home on the Range in California. And that's the subject of tonight's talks. And that book will be for sale also, and he will sign copies in the bookstore following the talk, as Jim mentioned already. Marc is also a founding member of the Appleton Whittle Research Ranch Foundation in Arizona and the Mingy International Museum of World Folk Art in San Diego. And that, I have to say, I don't know how many of you have been there, but that is one of my most favorite museums that I have ever visited. It is absolutely beautiful and is an outstanding museum. The Mingy International Museum of World Folk Art in San Diego. And Mingy is a Japanese term for folk art, I believe. Marc can tell me, can probably tell you better about that. But you will see wonderful wonderfully crafted things in this museum. Okay, he's served on the boards of trustees of Prescott College in Arizona, the Cooper Union in New York, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, the Dean's Council of the Yale School of Architecture, and in Santa Barbara, Casa del Herrero, Lotus Land, and the Santa Barbara Historical Museum. So, as I mentioned, he'll be signing books afterwards in the bookstore where you can meet him and chat with him personally. And I'd like to welcome Marc Appleton. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. I want to thank Judy Horton, too, and Jim earlier. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. The Huntington is one of my favorite places in the world. And I really thank the California Garden and Landscape History Society for tonight's event and for inviting me. It's a well-known fallacy that when you write a book about something, some people might think you're an expert on whatever topic it is and then actually invite you to talk about it. I want to assure you that I'm not a qualified historian on California, nor an expert on California ranches. I'm actually an architect, as Ann was describing, with a busy practice in Santa Barbara and Santa Monica. And it was interesting listening to Ann list off the books, because in my spare time over the last 20 years or so, I've enjoyed doing a bit of writing and publishing, mostly really esoteric books about architecture and architectural history with a very limited audience. Tailwater Press is a publishing entity I created, and is known for publishing unprofitable books which nobody in their right mind would publish if they thought they were actually going to make any money. Every so often, I will be asked to write for other publishers, which I also make nothing doing. So it's good I have a day job, I guess. The book on ranches, the reason I'm here tonight, came about when the New York publisher Rizzoli called me up and asked if I would be interested in doing a book on California cattle ranches with the photographer Melba Levick. This was the third book project that I'd done with Rizzoli, and the second one with Melba. And the editor there also knew that before I became an architect, I had grown up on ranches in Arizona, long before I became a more civilized city slicker. And so I was targeted, and the chance to do a book on ranches seemed like a really nice recess from architecture. The deadline was a couple years off. I said, sure, I'll be happy to do it. It's also true, I think, that our architectural practice does love to take on the design of ranches occasionally in larger agricultural projects. So I didn't really hesitate. I said yes, but I called them back the next day and said, I only want to do it if it's going to be a book on working cattle ranches. Rizzoli, as you might know, is known for its books on design and art and architecture and fashion. And I really didn't want to do a book about ranch architecture or Ralph Lauren's ranch house, which ironically, in retrospect, I think was very much in Rizzoli's mind. But they, without thinking about it, I think said, okay, you can do it on working ranches. And so off we went. Melba and I started researching and visiting and photographing potential ranches. And let's see if, I think I have to, no, it's on. Let me see. Good. So we started sending pictures into the publisher. These were some of the pictures we sent in. And we thought they were fairly nice, but the immediate response we got from the publisher was, no. We don't do pictures of people or animals or scenery. No cattle, no horses, no cowboys. We've never done a book about cowboys. And I replied that it was going to be pretty tough to do a book on working cattle ranches without some cattle and horses and people. And so we argued back and forth, and they finally relented, but they said, okay, but you also have to include pictures and talk about ranch houses. And they said that's what our readers are really interested in. So we included more pictures of ranch houses and the barns and the buildings that were part of the ranch environment. Some of these were historically vernacular. Some were architecturally appealing. Some were even contemporary in design. But others were a little plain, a little tattered, a little dirty and the worse for wear. And we got another reaction from the publisher saying that they really didn't look clean and appealing enough from a design standpoint. They were too worn and romantic maybe, but too worn and dirty. And I tried to explain that most ranchers typically couldn't afford or weren't interested in hiring architects and designers. And the working ranches were, by definition, a little dirty and worn, or they wouldn't be working ranches. In fact, a lot of bona fide ranchers that I met in the course of doing this book live in makeshift trailers and mobile homes. And so we had more heated arguments about this. And I had to remind them that they had just published a wonderful book on Cuba, showing a lot of old buildings that were in a state of disrepair and even collapse, and that it was a great success. They didn't buy into that argument too quickly, so we compromised again, and we focused at their request on including some more interiors, which they were getting more excited about. I love that pair. And there were a lot of details that we could focus on here. Something I discovered in the course of all this that also changed the focus of the book a bit is that cattle ranching in California is no longer the successful industry it once was, and that finding ranches that were still successful working cattle ranches was not as easy as I had initially assumed. I had originally identified about 125 ranches for the book, researched them. That number was reduced to about 75, and after further researching and actually visiting a lot of these ranches, we would end up with about 20, and with only a handful of those being significant working ranches. A lot of working ranches just weren't interested in being in a book. But we did have a handful of them. And what I really realized in all this is that the reputation of the Western ranch, its image, if you will, for most of us, had survived long past its heyday. And this led me into examining a little more closely the history of cattle ranching in California, which dated back to the Spanish occupation in what is now Mexico, to 1535, the building of the missions 2 centuries after that. The Spanish arrived in 1535. About 200 years after that, they moved into Alta California. From 1769 to 1823, which is when all of the missions were built. And then following that, the eventual establishment of the great ranchos following Mexico's separatist war of independence from Spain and their takeover in 1822. Where the Spanish had actually had an interest in cultivating Christianity among the native populations, the New Mexican government instead had a much more strong interest in cultivating economic benefits for their new government and to fill their coffers. And in an effort to promote settlement and more agricultural development in Alta California, the California that we know, they secularized the missions and subdivided the mission lands in 1833 and sold off land grants. And that created this great network of California's ranchos. In California, even though today most of the original ranchos have disappeared, the ranchos are very much a part of the real estate empire and often referenced. And there are some buildings that are historical landmarks left over from that era. So we decided to include a few of these in the book. This is the Asa Estancia from Rancho Santa Margarita. And the Asa Estancia was an assisting mission to the main missions. It's protected now by a barn that's been built around it. This is Rancho Los Alamitos, a very well-known hangover from that era, and Rancho Los Alamitos probably has one of the most active and best preservation and cultural programs of all of the ranchos that are sort of now historic museums or landmarks. Interior from Rancho Los Alamitos. And this, closer to home, is Rancho Camulos. This is up near Ventura, just east of Ventura. And you might possibly remember as being the scene for the first film, a G.W. Griffith film starring Lillian Gish, of Ramona, the Helen Hunt Jackson novel that essentially put the West into the United States vocabulary. In the course of all this, we also decided at some point along the way to include trophy or celebrity ranches, ones that have contributed to the romance and lore of ranch life in California, and we felt that they had a place. This is Will Rogers Ranch. You see all the names on the horses. Rogers was famous for saying he had much better quarters for his horses than his guests, and it's quite true. He had that wonderful barn you see in the background is still here, and it's a beautiful building. And our New York publisher at this point, with these editions, was very much happier about the way the book was going. But I didn't really want to turn the focus away from my original premise of trying to look at working cattle ranches and their situation today. So we did, in fact, this is Will Rogers again. He did roping practice on his taxidermy, by the way. Those of you who probably know Will Rogers, I think he's one of the great Americans of all time. I wish we had him today in our current political climate. He'd have some choice things to say. But he started as a trick roper in rodeos and shows. This is, let's see. This is Beauty Ranch up in Glen Ellen near Sonoma County. It's Jack London's ranch, the writer. And London was actually quite serious about ranching and experimenting. That's him on the horse. These are some of the buildings. That's his typewriter. That's his pig palace, designed in a circle so that you could kind of feed and water the pigs from a central location and keep an eye on them. And this was a rather grand house called Wolf House that he had designed and actually built on the property. But literally a week before he was about to move into it, it burned to the ground. He always wanted to rebuild it, never did. This is the ruin of that fire. This is the McRae Ranch. That's Joel McRae, the actor, and his wife Frances. It's still around and with us, and has near Thousand Oaks. Has a wonderful ranch house, rambling ranch house, designed by John Byers. And as I said, I didn't with all these additions, I really didn't want to forget about working cattle ranches. So we did finally come back to that, and this is Rancho Cienega del Galiban in Hollister, California, in a photo from 1867. It was established in 1843, shortly after the Mexican occupation. Here's that same ranch house today, not much changed. It's still a working cattle ranch after all this time. This is Hoonawil Ranch near Bridgeport. It's a working ranch that was established in 1861. This is Likely Land and Livestock, still very much a working ranch today, and still in the Flournoy family that originally settled it in 1871. So these ranches began to warm my heart and give me hope that, in fact, we could at least include some of the original premise of the book that I had originally hoped to write. This is 5 Dot Ranch in Standish, still a working ranch, very much so. And last but not least, this is the Hearst Ranch, Piedra Blanca Rancho, established by George Hearst, William Randolph Hearst's father, the senator, in 1865, and it's pretty well known. I suspect most of you have been to visit San Simeon, the castle. You can kind of see it here, just there in the hazy distance below the word rancho. Julia Morgan, who was William Randolph Hearst's architect, also designed buildings for the ranch, and this, in typically grandiose Hearst style, is the ranch's poultry manager's house. May we all be so lucky. So all those working ranches are profiled in the book. They're all survivors in a changing world. So they still must be doing something right to have been able to hold on to those cherished environments so long and sometimes remain in the same family hands, which is doubly rewarding. But they're a minority. The fate of most California ranches has been determined by historical events. And if you go back again to Mexico, that new and somewhat unsteady Mexican government that came to power in 1822, and that network of ranchos did not last long because a greedy United States annexed Texas in 1846, and it led to a larger conflict, the Mexican-American War, not just over Texas, but all the other Western territories. The war was settled only 2 years later by treaty in 1848, and California, along with Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and Colorado were ceded to the U.S. by Mexico. Sometimes I forget that California was made a state not that long ago in 1850. But the Northern Anglos, already encouraged by the gold rush in 1848, were taking over. And the U.S. 1852 Land Commission process, which expedited the ability for Anglos to acquire land, speeded the process. That was followed by the Homestead Act in 1862. And a lot of those ranches that you looked at that are working ranches today are owned and run by families that back in those days acquired it pretty much in that era. However, after the U.S. won the Mexican-American War, with the increasing demand for hides and tallow, as well as beef, cattle ranching, it really began to expand exponentially in California. In the 1860s, an economic recession, which was coupled with a severe drought followed by record rains and then another drought, crippled a lot of the small ranchers and the homesteads, and wealthy entrepreneurs stepped in and started taking over much of the ranch land. The book that Jim held up, which is called Cattle on a Thousand Hills, the author Robert Clellan colorfully describes this era, but it was a period when cattle barons like Henry Miller and Charles Lux, the so-called industrial cowboys, acquired huge tracts of land and began to monopolize cattle ranching in the state and also a lot of the water rights. Towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, however, cattle ranching in California began to give way to other forces and other industries. It would eventually become a marginalized enterprise, victim of California's population growth, suburban and exurban subdivisions, and challenged by the huge and more productive feedlots that were located in the Midwest. I want to break for a minute and look at a more personal experience from my own life. From the age of 11, I grew up on 3 ranches in Arizona. This was the first ranch in a little town called Sahuarita between Tucson and Nogales. It's in the Santa Cruz River Valley. Here was the ranch headquarters. I think my father thought my mother was crazy, but she talked him into moving from Los Angeles to this somewhat deserted environment. This is a picture. I mean, the house was nothing. Certainly wouldn't be in any of Rizzoli's books. And here are my 2 younger sisters, Lynn on the left and Lee on the right. And this area is now called Green Valley. Last time I drove back there, it's been irrigated by ground wells. It's no longer a desert. It's a suburb of Tucson with housing developments and shopping centers and golf courses. But back in my childhood, it was very much what you saw in these pictures. This is another ranch called the Estart Ranch in the Alpine Mountain area of northeastern Arizona, and I spent 7 summers here living with the owners, Jack and Lou LeMay Brooks, and their family. They had homesteaded it in the early 20th century. They had no electricity. For me as a teenager, I think it was one of the most important formative experiences of my life and where I learned an awful lot. And I hope I can someday write a book about my experiences there. It was just a really unusual place and an unusual and remarkable family. But back to the Appleton clan, this is the second ranch my family moved to in the early 1960s. And it's near a little town in southeastern Arizona called Elgin that had a population of 8. And I think it might have a population of 15 now, maybe. More about this ranch later, but I want to go back briefly to the book again. We'll return to this in a minute. The working title of the book had always been California Ranches, with the subtitle The Passing of a Way of Life. And when I handed in the completed manuscript, the editor was very happy, but Rizzoli's marketing department was not and had concerns. And I asked them what their concerns were, and they listed them as being, even though it was actually the theme of the book, they felt that passing of a way of life was too negative a message. They also didn't want the word California in the title. They thought nobody outside of California would buy the book, which is a ridiculous comment, but New Yorkers sometimes make remarks like that. They're very provincial, you know. Also, the title needed to have house or home in it. They were still stressing this idea that they'd missed out on Ralph Lauren's house or something. So it could appeal to the customers that they felt were their base customers, and the ones that would be buying the book. And the marketing department of these publishing houses holds a lot of clout when it comes to things like that. So this all led to renewed arguments about the title for the book and the dust jacket, and reviewing alternative titles. And finally, Melba and I were so exhausted, we just settled on Ranches, Home on the Range in California. more out of exhaustion than anything else. Not that it was a title that indicated what the book was about at all, but it did seem kind of ironic and catchy, or at least I had been lulled into thinking that at the time. And so the other thing that was funny was when the book came out, finally was published, I noticed on Rizzoli's website that they really didn't know where to put it, because it didn't fit into their nice, neat little categories. And it wound up being listed under houses and homes decorating, or some section of their website like that, which isn't, I think, where you would really go to expect to find a book on cattle ranches. It's wonderful it's found an audience at all. I'm grateful you're all here paying attention to it, even though it was published a few years ago. What I think has endured for me, though, and continued to fascinate me, is the memory of ranching as part of our Western cultural identity. And it comes not only from my own background, I think, but the research I wound up doing for the book sort of led me to that same conclusion. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the real-life vaquero or cowboy was already becoming an idealized figure, as we know, much romanticized in literature by authors like Zane Grey and Will James, depicted by artists like Frederick Remington and Charles Russell and Edward Borean, and finally, last but not least, memorialized, as we all know, in Hollywood and in many films. Along with this, I think the cattle ranch, to some degree, also became a mythical creation, something imagined more than actually experienced by most of us. And I concluded the introduction in the book with the following comments, which if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read to you. However idealized in our national psyche, it could still be argued that the values and lessons learned from ranch life have traditionally been more constructive than most urban experiences, and so, perhaps understandably, the legend persists. The character traits of the fictionalized cowboy do indeed have a foundation in ranching. We can discount the myth, but we must recognize and appreciate the character, and that character is still shared by many working ranchers. I'm in sympathy with those ranchers who try to hold on to something to which they and their ancestors were devoted and took for granted. I admire their stubbornness against the odds. If I could choose a companion to ride with into the unknown, give me the rancher any day over the professor, banker, politician, lawyer, even architect. Perhaps in my case, this is partly sentimental nostalgia, but to this day, I believe most ranchers to be generally tougher, more observant, and less complaining company than most people. By the same token, I think the California ranch may be a much reduced, oppressed, and battered version of its former self, but it still merits our attention even today before it's gone forever. How can we caretake remaining ranch land is an important question, one that challenges us, I think, to come up with creative and environmentally conscientious solutions. As environments or places that historically hold special memory for many, do they invariably have to fall prey to urban growth and subdivision when the business of grazing livestock is no longer viable? Retiring ranch families who care about the land they have grown up with are not faced with readily available options, and I met quite a few of them in the course of doing the book. Most simply sell to the highest bidder, often a developer, but there are exceptions. This again is my family's last ranch near Elgin, Arizona, 9,000 acres of deeded and U.S. Forest and BLM, Bureau of Land Management, leased land. In 1968, my mother and father decided that raising registered Hereford cattle was not a profitable or a sensible business with a future. But they loved the ranch. They loved its wild oak savanna environment. And they came to their 4 children with a proposition. Give up your inheritance so that we can create a nonprofit conservation area devoted to ecological research. They wanted to call it the Research Ranch. We children were still young enough to be ignorant of what giving up our inheritance meant, I guess. So we said, okay. At the time, oddly enough, there were no examples of this kind of thing in the area, much less the state of Arizona, of BLM, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Arizona State Forest Service lease land that weren't grazed, farmed, or mined, basically abused in some way. Believe it or not, it took several years of lobbying, with Stuart Udall's support, mind you, to convince these agencies that leasing land just to leave it alone was an acceptable lease use. That was the mindset of our government at the time. If you leased U.S. forest land, of course you had to graze on it, you had to mine it, you had to do something with it. Today, over 50 years later, the ranch is called the Appleton Wattell Research Ranch. The Wattell family gave a donation that allowed an endowment for director and staff, and it's survived my family and operates more or less as we envisioned it, as a relatively untouched conservation area where faculty and students from several universities can do field work comparing the rich ranch environment and its fauna and flora, which have all kind of bounced back once grazing was removed, and compare that to neighboring ranch land and developments. So it's, in a way, it's a very useful comparative tool. This is a photograph out of one of the publications from the ranch. It's an ex-urban development near Sonoyta, which is a neighboring town to Elgin, and you can see the kind of thing that happens when subdivision happens in a fragile environment, and this is a very, very fragile environment. Look at the difference between the untouched parcels and the touched parcels. So that ranch is one example of what can happen to retain a part of history and a particular environment. This is an aerial photograph of Beauty Ranch, Jack London's ranch in Glen Ellen, and it too is a nonprofit foundation established by the family heirs in 1959 with a donation of a large portion of the ranch to the Parks and Recreation Department of the state of California. The state of California, the Parks and Recreation Department couldn't financially sustain it. And it's now called the Jack London State Historic Park, and the Parks and Recreation Department, their survival has been assisted by another nonprofit that grew up locally called the Valley of the Moon Natural History Association. And it's open to the public, open to visitors, has a fairly active program of public and private events. It's managed to keep its identity, its environmental identity, even under new uses. This is a little different example. This is a relatively new working ranch, also in the book, that was started in 2009. It's called Belcampo Farms, and some of you may be familiar with the Belcampo meat outlets around the state that are owned by Belcampo Farms. What they're promoting is meat from grass-fed livestock, following a philosophy and butchering methods inspired by Temple Grandin. I think some of you may remember who Temple Grandin was. Belcampo has taken control of the entire process of breeding, raising, feeding, processing, delivering to market, and actually marketing their products. This is a real farm-to-table example of ranching with not unfounded pretensions, I think, and certainly towards a healthier menu when it comes to the meat products. Time will tell if it succeeds longer term. Another example of a ranch in transition, if you will, is Hollister Ranch near Lompoc on the California coast. It's in the middle foreground here, right here, overlooking the Pacific. It's a beautiful part of the coastline. In its heyday, it was a significant holding owned by the Hollister family. Here's a group photo of ranch personnel from about 1870, looking like a pretty rowdy bunch, if I do say so. You'll notice the occasional bottle of booze and a firearm or two in there. In 1970, a developer who purchased the ranch arranged finally to subdivide the 14,400 acres of the ranch into 135 parcels. And you can see the parcels here, but they stipulated, the Homeowners Association that was established as part of the development received a significant portion of each of these parcels for agricultural use and for grazing. They reserved it, basically. And the Hollister Ranch Cattle Cooperative, which still grazes cattle across all of the properties, is managed by the Hollister Ranch Conservancy, and the two butt heads occasionally, the Conservancy feeling like the cattle are at certain points destroying the land. The cattle cooperative pushes back, but they have a very active debate, which is healthy, I think, towards maintaining both the ranch grazing as well as environmental considerations. And what's more, several homeowners work regularly as cowhands under the ranch manager, and this has been a pretty unusual, but so far in many ways successful partnership. Hollister's greatest battle these days is with the Coastal Commission, which wants to open the coastline up to public access. It's a very cherished surfing area, and the Coastal Commission has it in mind that it should be open to the public. I have mixed feelings about the Coastal Commission, although I kind of agree with a lot of its principles. I don't agree with the way it works, which is to use something that we all grew up thinking was actually a crime, extortion. But this is a very heated battle for Hollister Ranch now, and it remains to be seen what's going to happen. I have a feeling if the Coastal Commission succeeds, this will not be quite the partnership that Hollister Ranch had become. The last example I'd like to share with you of a ranch in transition is the Santa Lucia Preserve above Carmel Valley. And you can see it here. This, for those of you that know Carmel Valley, is all the developed area of Carmel Valley here, and this is, you have to drive up about a half hour up into Rancho San Carlos here to this property to get there. But it was purchased in the late 1920s by a guy named George Gordon Moore, who was a New York entrepreneur and a bon vivant, and speculated by some to have been the model for F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Quite a character. He lost the ranch following the Depression, and eventually, when its ranching days were over, it was purchased in 1990 by an inspired group of developers called the Rancho San Carlos Partnership. It took the partnership several years, but they were ultimately successful in creating a private community subdivision of almost 300 home sites. Building envelopes for each of the houses planned were very restricted. They were thoughtfully located so that most of the homes couldn't intrude on the view visually or be seen, and the natural scenery of the ranch was protected. 18,000 of the 20,000 acres remain wilderness. They're not part of these home sites. So this is even a step further than Hollister in terms of creative subdivision. And you're not allowed to build fences here outside your envelope. In other words, no fences are permitted on your property. other than those specific to the house. And this is so that wildlife can travel pretty much unrestricted throughout the ranch. And it makes for conflicts, interesting conflicts between human beings and wildlife occasionally, but it's an acceptable, if not at times tense, coexistence. The main ranch headquarters for Moore's Ranch were renovated and adapted for use as a community center, restaurant, and hotel. The ranch buildings, per se, were all reaccommodated and their use adapted to the new development. And I think this has been a really pretty successful example of retaining an environment, maybe even in a funny sort of way, more so than if you were running cattle all over it. So those last 5 ranches, with the exception of the Appleton Whitell Research Ranch in Arizona, are all in the book, and they represent, each differently, but I think with varying degrees of success, how ranch land can remain active, and more importantly, perhaps transition to new uses without adversely impacting the environment. There's obviously greater awareness these days about sustainable rangeland management. You've all heard about grass-fed livestock, and a lot of this awareness has allowed ranchers to adapt in healthier ways, but it's likely that we're going to lose more and more ranch land to progress. Some ranches are partnering with environmental groups like Nature Conservancy or creating permanent ranch easements by partnering with organizations like the California Rangeland Trust. And there were examples of this in the book. A lot of those working ranches that we have in the book are already negotiating and or have partnered with California Rangeland Trust. The Hearst family has, for example. And these partnerships, I think, can prevent subdivision, preserve the land, and protect the ranch environments. But along with preservation, I think we need more creative planning. I think that's required when development of the land becomes inevitable. Ranches have been inextricably a part of our Western history and our identity. Doing the book reminded me of that. But I think it remains to be seen how carefully we inherit and adapt that legacy. Thank you very much. I know I'm under an hour, and I don't know, Jim? Are you here? I'm right here. Oh, I don't know if anybody wants to do Q&A or I have to run off to the bookstore and...
You have a few minutes.
Okay.
And let's set a time limit so that what happens with Q&A often is people get so caught up in the Q&A, then people get annoyed that they didn't get to buy the book or get the book signed. So let's take.
That's a tough
minutes.
challenge for me.
Yeah, let's.
Okay. Well, maybe we ought to limit it to three
like,
questions or something.
Yeah, 3 or 4 questions.
Okay.
Who's got a question? We've got a microphone over here. Anybody got it?
They're thinking about buying the book instead, I guess.
Yeah. And you got one too. I've got one up here. Here you go.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My wife and I maybe are one of the few people in this room that actually do own a cattle ranch, or at least 42 acres on a cattle ranch up in the Yosemite foothills. And I just wanted to comment, maybe you could add to it, that I don't know how many people know about the Williamson Act, but we don't pay any, it's a California statute which exempts ranch land from property tax. And so in that way, originally the state would compensate the counties for the profit they might have, the taxes they might have lost. But they took that away some years ago. But the county that we're in, Madera County, nevertheless kept up its part of the bargain, and so there's no property tax. So that's another way that they're encouraging ranch land. So
Yeah, actually the Williamson Act, I think, is, even in our architectural practice, we run into it quite a bit. And it has different requirements for those landholders who can utilize it. They can generally develop and build more buildings. And there's a great tax relief, as you point out.
Couple more? You got one over there?
Mark, I wondered if you could talk about that list that you generated in order to sort of the one that you narrowed down from. How did you find all those properties, and what were the kind of sources that you were using in order to discover what the body of ranches was that you were trying to?
Well, I did a lot of looking and asking. I mean, I called everybody I knew that knew somebody that had a ranch. It was, in the beginning, it was kind of a shotgun approach. What I discovered was, when I really started looking at the properties, that a lot of them weren't cattle ranches, and we were kind of focused on cattle. So the minute somebody was raising sheep or pigs or something like that, it kind of fell out by the wayside. The other thing that happened is that there were a lot of smaller ranches that were interesting, and I want to come back to that before I finish answering your question. But they weren't part of this statewide network that had begun with the ranchos and the larger tracts of land and the larger ranches. And they hadn't been around, or they hadn't been around that long. They had just literally entered the world, if you will. And there were an awful lot of people that go into ranching because, they want that life. They've lived in the city, they have enough money, they want a house in the country, and that too was somewhat discouraging because the actual business of raising cattle and ranching seemed less important than just owning a piece of property in the wilderness somewhere. But what I want to say about small ranches and small farms is that I think you're going to see them, a resurgence and them coming back. If you read people like Dan Daggett and other writers, you realize that the sympathetic partnership between mankind and the environment is traditionally better managed by smaller operations. It's the large corporate farms and the large corporate ranches that have kind of created a lot of the problems, that start using the chemicals that we all don't like to read about, the antibiotics and growth hormones that are used in the Midwest in these feedlots is appalling. The chemicals used just to get rid of and deal with the manure and urine in the Midwestern feedlots. If you saw a documentary about it, you'd be horrified. You probably might be enough to convince you not to eat another hamburger. The other thing that's happening, and I do mention it in the book, is that we're seeing the advent of vegetable-based meat byproducts, like Beyond Meat, I think I mentioned in the book, and it's now, I guess, a stock you should buy, or maybe you've missed the window, I don't know. But we're going to see more and more of that because the World Health Organization came out with a report 4 years ago concluding fairly conclusively that red meat is not that good for us, at least maybe in moderation, but not the way Americans are used to eating it. When I grew up on ranches, of course, we were members of the Arizona Cattle Growers Association. We had bumper stickers on our trucks that said, "Eat beef, keep slim." All these kind of lies that are promoted because you're raising a product and you want to sell it. But I just have a much broader view now. In part, I thank my parents for that, for their decision to stop ranching and love the land a little more than the business of making money from raising registered Hereford cows. But I've strayed from your question, but I think it was really difficult finding substantial ranch operations that were still viable. But we did find them. We just got, part of it was this book of this little fist fight we had with the publisher along the way and needing to make concessions. This wasn't a book I was publishing, so I had no control over it. I was a hired hand. So it was fun. I look back on it. I have, by the way, nothing but praise for Rizzoli, notwithstanding the story I gave you tonight. They're a fun place to do a book with. And Melba's a great photographer, and I always enjoy working with her. But it wasn't the book I had imagined doing, and I hope somebody does it someday. Maybe I did the trailer for it, I don't know.
One more question?
Yes?
One.
The Hollister Ranch and the public good of accessing to the beach and trying to keep the preserve going. How's conflicts like that going to go forward in your mind politically in the state?
You mean the partnership between the homeowners and the cattle operation?
Well, in the thing where the coastal commission.
Oh, coastal commission.
Protect the public and allow them to get access to the surf break and the camping or whatever's going to happen there. And versus, and that, by the way, for those who don't know, El Capitan Beach camping is there. There's a lot of history of activity around where the Hollister Beach thing is, so it's very much a dilemma. And I'm just asking how you, and I'm sure that's not the only issue you ran into up and down the state, because there's other people that are trying to block access for public good and so forth. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I don't know. I think if the public record of the Coastal Commission is any example, I think they're likely to pervade, and I think what that means, particularly for Hollister Ranch, is that you're going to get a lot more traffic on the one road that goes up and down the coast. What it's going to do as a kind of after effect to the subdivision there, I don't know. But I'm not optimistic about it.
When you say subdivision, you mean housing? I thought they were preserved the rest of it.
No, there are 31 lots, I think, there. They're sizable lots. Like Rancho San Carlos, you can build a house on them, you can build a barn on them, you can farm on them, but you also have to let the cooperative cattle graze across your land. In other words, there's no real fences in certain areas preventing that. And it's a cooperative arrangement that the homeowners association actually established.
And what you're talking about, is that 101 or 85?
No, 101, because of Hollister Ranch, 101 takes a direct right turn eastward at the southeastern end of Hollister Ranch, and that's a private road from there. You cannot drive through, for example, to Point Conception or beyond.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, that was really nice. You did a great job.
I'm glad you liked it.
And so those of you who wish to join us, go to the bookstore, buy your book, and we'll see you at the sign-in table.